We've heard stories about people surviving in the desert, Amazon forest, and uninhabited islands for weeks. Such stories show how tough and resilient people can be. But among these many cases, there is one that can really amaze you. It's the story about a guy who spent 3 days inside a sunken ship at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. He didn't have oxygen tanks, electricity, communications, or food, but he survived. So, it all happened in 2013 on a tugboat that was moving through the Atlantic waters along the coast of Nigeria. That day, early in the morning, there was a small storm. The tug was pulling a vessel with oil tanks. Then, all of a sudden, a huge wave formed. It crashed into the ship and broke the cable. At 4:30 a.m., the tugboat turned upside down. Its entire deck was underwater, and the ship's hull stuck out from the surface. The boat began to sink slowly. The crew of 12 people were trapped, as they all were in their locked rooms. They had closed the doors in their cabins as a precaution, since there were many pirates in those waters. Because of the locked rooms, they couldn't get out. But one of them, cook Harrison Okina, was in the bathroom during this time. The bathroom turned over. Harrison fell on the ceiling. All the clothes and toilet shelves fell on his head. He was stunned and didn't understand what was happening. When he heard the screams of the other crew members, he realized that the ship was sinking. Harrison struggled to his feet. Holding on to the walls, he slowly went out of the cabin. The water level rose above his head. Harrison took a deep breath. He intuitively, driven by fear, reached the engineering room. There was a small pocket with air. This space wasn't wholly flooded, since the water didn't get there, and the air hadn't come out. Harrison realized that this was the safest place for him at that moment. He had no fresh water and no food. He was in a cold, damp room. The floor was flooded, and Harrison's feet began to freeze. There was almost no chance of survival. The man found a soda bottle inside the room and a life jacket with 2 flashlights attached to it. By this time, the ship had descended to the bottom of the ocean at a depth of 100 feet. This is about the height of a 10-story building. The ship's hull was squeezed and made a grinding noise due to the pressure of the water. Then, Harrison heard a strange movement outside the door. It was sharks and other fish that were investigating the deck. At this point, Harrison began to lose hope. Lack of food supplies and pressure weren't the main problems. The air pocket was small, which meant there was little oxygen. Every 24 hours, an average person consumes about 350 cubic feet of air, which means Harrison had less than 1 day left to breathe. But despite this, he lived in such conditions for about 60 hours. This happened thanks to the water. The pressure around the ship was so intense that it compressed the air by about 4 times. Another problem was the cook's breathing. When we inhale, we absorb oxygen. When we exhale, we release carbon dioxide. This substance is dangerous to your health if its concentration in the air is 5%. Harrison slowly filled the room with carbon dioxide, and he couldn't get out. With each hour, it became harder to breathe. But here again, he was lucky. Water absorbs carbon dioxide, and Harrison moved and splashed it in different directions. Thus, unknowingly, he increased the water area and kept the carbon dioxide level below critical. But even here, his dangers were not over. Hypothermia may occur in a dark, cold room. It's a condition when your body temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. You get cold, and your perception of the world gets distorted. You don't understand where you are and what's going on. You may lose your memory and even experience terminal burrowing. This weird behavior occurs during hypothermia when a person tries to find a small shelter, even if they're in a closed room. They can even start digging the cold floor with their bare hands. At the same time, a person quickly freezes and loses consciousness within 2 hours. Harrison's room was filled from below with icy water. He wouldn't have survived in such conditions if he had stayed on the floor for several hours. But he managed to build a small platform with a mattress. This kept him slightly above the water level. With each passing hour, fear and despair more and more bound the survivor's mind. He couldn't get out for many reasons. One of them was that only a little sunlight passes to such a depth, and Harrison couldn't see it. The soda bottle was almost empty, and the flashlight stopped working. The man found himself in pitch darkness, but his salvation was close. While rescuers were searching for survivors nearby, he was thinking about his family and life. Harrison noticed rays of light through a hole in the wreckage. Divers were examining the seabed. It was the only chance to survive. Harrison came out of the air pocket and swam towards the rescuers. He was making his way through the darkness. The ray of light coming from the diver's flashlight disappeared. Harrison tried blindly to find the diver, but they were at the other end of the deck. His oxygen was running out, so Harrison decided to return. There was almost no air left in his lungs. He began to suffocate, but still got to the rescue room. The main thing was not to despair. It was his only chance for salvation. After catching his breath and replenishing the oxygen supply in his lungs, Harrison made a second attempt. He got out of the room and noticed the diver. He swam towards them with all of his might. The lifeguard didn't see Harrison, so the cook knocked on his neck from behind and grabbed his hand tightly. The diver was initially scared, but he realized a living person was in front of him. Harrison swam to his room and led the lifeguard as his oxygen ran out. You can easily find a recording from the diver's camera on the internet, where the frightened Harrison was in his rescue room during a meeting with the diver. The rescuers gave him an oxygen mask. They didn't believe there was a living person in front of them. Harrison couldn't immediately get to the surface because of the pressure. He spent about 60 hours on the seabed, so he needed to change the pressure levels slowly to prevent damage to his health. Therefore, the divers put him in a decompression chamber to gradually reduce the external pressure. Then, when Harrison got out, he saw the stars. The cook thought that he had been at the bottom of the ocean all day, so he was surprised when he found out that he had been underwater for 60 hours. Also, he thought that all the crew members had forgotten about him and left the ship at the beginning. Many years have passed since then, but Harrison still has nightmares about his air room. Sometimes he wakes up in the middle of the night and tells his wife that the bed is sinking and they're now at sea. A similar case occurred in 1991 with scuba diver Michael Proudfoot. He was studying a sunken submarine off the coast of Baja, California. During this dive, he accidentally broke his breathing regulator and deprived himself of oxygen reserves. Michael couldn't get to the surface because he was too deep. He wouldn't have had enough air in his lungs. Fortunately, the diver found an air pocket inside the ship. He swam there and waited for rescuers. For 2 days, he was underwater in complete darkness. He ate raw sea urchins and drank a small amount of warm water from a found pot. Fortunately, rescuers found him. Michael Proudfoot got out of the trap and stayed alive.
The 28-year-old patient shows up at the hospital with distressing symptoms. He explained to the doctors that he felt really bad chest discomfort and had been coughing badly for quite some time. The medical staff knew right away there was no time to waste, so he was scheduled for an X-ray. Weirdly, there was nothing unusual about the X-ray results. The patient just had a mass in his lungs that they needed to remove as soon as possible. Sure, it wasn't the best news for the man, but it was certainly nothing the doctors hadn't seen before. But that first opinion changed on the day of the surgery. Not only was the whole operation more difficult than they had initially expected, but the mass they removed from the patient had an unusual shape. When the probe was sent for further investigation, the doctors were puzzled. It was a small fir tree. The doctors that had participated in the operation thought that the man must have inhaled a seed which settled inside the man's lungs. After the seed grew into a sapling, its little needles started to damage the tissue surrounding it, which resulted in chest discomfort and coughing. As the story gained more popularity, scientists weighed in on the mysterious story, and they weren't so quick to accept it, saying it was most likely made up. On one hand, most plants need a lot of sunlight to grow, which isn't available in a human lung. More so, if it were that simple, we'd all have things growing in our bodies. Small seeds aren't that hard to swallow or inhale, right? This wasn't the only story about plants growing in a human lung that baffled scientists. In 2010, a man from Massachusetts was hospitalized after his lung collapsed. Again, this didn't seem to take doctors by surprise, as unfortunate as it was, because the patient already had a history of respiratory issues. Nevertheless, they discovered a mass inside the man's lung and removed it immediately. What they found was equally as surprising as the fir tree, a small pea plant. Only this time, doctors suggested that the man probably had peas for dinner. But that one simply went the wrong way and didn't end up in his stomach as it should have. Once it reached his lungs, the small pea got comfortable and began sprouting leaves. The truth is a bit more complex in this case, but it does make it more plausible. Turns out that the piece that was removed from the man's lung was only about half an inch long. Something that small doesn't qualify as a full-grown plant. But the seed was able to grow though. That's because a pea seed can sprout even without light. It naturally does that underground. The seed doesn't need to have any light at this point because the tiny seed has enough energy stored inside to help it grow to the level of the soil, where it gets the sunlight it needs to continue. Because of their relationship with the sun, plants are called autotrophs, or organisms that use exposure to light to feed themselves. A lot of us think that plants get their daily menu from the soil we place them in, but that's not feeding them. Plants need sunlight, water, and the gases in the air to produce glucose, the substance they use for food. This whole process is called photosynthesis and is performed by all plants, algae, and even a bunch of microorganisms, like the purple sulfur bacteria. Now back to our unfortunate human patient. While it's true that the pea seed might have germinated since it had sufficient moisture in there to survive, it didn't grow into a full-sized plant. It would have needed sunlight for that so that photosynthesis could begin. That's not to say it wasn't damaging or dangerous. A lot of other emergency room doctors have similar stories too, like this one coming from some doctors in Essex, whose patient initially seemed to have lost her dentures. The woman was elderly and already had memory problems, and they initially didn't give this mistake much thought. That wasn't until the woman was later discovered to have some other problems with her lungs too. It didn't take them long to connect the dots and figure out that the woman's upper dentures weren't all lost. They were just inside her body. The woman had swallowed them but didn't realize, and they got stuck at the bottom of her throat, also causing her respiratory problems. Not all such mishaps happened by accident. Another man in the UK wanted to offer his fiancée the engagement ring of her dreams, but it didn't fit his budget. So he came up with what he believed to be a clever plan. He went to the jewelry parlor and patiently waited for the jeweler to shift his focus from the ring for a split second. As soon as that happened, he swallowed the ring. The jeweler wasn't easily tricked and called the police. Once under the metal detectors, the man could only confess. The crafty romantic was escorted to a cell where he was expected to, pass the ring back to its rightful owner. It's not the only reason people were caught swallowing jewelry. A woman once came up to the emergency doctor complaining about stomach pains. There was nothing bizarre about her. On the contrary, she was a middle-aged woman, both fashionable and tidy. Her physical exam didn't reveal anything suspicious about her. But the x-ray they had to make sure did. As they were looking at the images, the doctors were perplexed. A whole lot of jewelry was stuck inside the woman's stomach and intestines. The medical staff obviously questioned her about how the objects got there, and her response was even more outrageous. She said she wanted to keep her jewelry safe from her husband, which she claimed had a bit of a habit of gifting her jewelry to other women. Nice guy. One other doctor remembered having a patient with a bottle cap stuck in his throat. The problem is, he didn't even notice he had a strange object stuck inside of him. It was simply discovered at a routine checkup. Fortunately, no surgery was needed to fish this one out. Doctors managed to get it out using a small medical net. They were curious how this man managed to get a bottle cap stuck in his throat and not even know it. His response was simple. He did remember drinking water some days prior, but he couldn't find the cap. He brushed the whole thing off and went on with his day. Other times, naughty things we do when we were young can come back to haunt us years later. A 30-year-old woman surely learned this lesson the hard way when she ended up in the emergency room with a stuffy nose. No medicine seemed to help, so she knew she had to get it examined by a professional. Once the doctors had a look, they realized she had some inflamed tissue up her nose and something that resembled a foreign object. It also looked like that object had been there for quite some time. They couldn't figure out what it was, so she was immediately taken to the operating room. What the surgeons removed was then taken to be further investigated, and it turned out to be some sort of material resembling paper. After they questioned her, the woman did remember having stuffed some paper in her nose when she was little, but was just as surprised as the doctors that the small piece had stayed there up her nose for over 20 years. Some extractions of foreign objects are more complicated than others. A kid ended up at the emergency room after he stuffed his brother's plastic construction toy up his nose. As the doctors were trying to carefully remove it, the kid coughed, and the toy went down his throat and into his stomach. Both the doctors and the kid's family patiently waited for the boy to pass the toy out to the final destination. That's probably because the kid wanted to give it back to his brother. But it's probably okay for the kid to keep it.
The SCP Foundation is a secret organization that has one goal: to secure, contain, and protect the world from bizarre creatures and objects. The secret bases of this organization are hidden all over the world, and each of them contains scary, dangerous, harmless, miraculous, and simply crazy objects. And now, you'll see some of the weirdest. Object SCP-410. This is a colony of 14 individual beetles, similar to Scarabaeus of different colors, from light blue to dark emerald. At first glance, they look like ordinary insects, but soon you notice that these bugs don't feed on leaves, larvae, and other food. They eat mistakes in a text.
What?
Put a paper with some text containing spelling or grammar mistakes and syntactic errors inside the terrarium with object SCP-410. The bugs run up to misspelled words or punctuation errors and eat them. 20 minutes later, the beetles secrete corrected letters or words from their bodies. This way, they completely edit the text. One member of SCP-410 can eat about 25,000 errors per day. The beetles can live without incorrect texts for about 2 days. Then they fall into a state of hibernation. To revive them, you need to put a text containing at least 50 errors next to them. Object SCP-2157 is a mysterious 200 square foot piece of land found in a forest in Japan. People are standing in different poses on this territory. 20 men and 21 women. They're all of different weights and heights. Their feet are on the ground, and their faces are turned to the west. People react to external stimuli. They blink, flinch, and get scared. And still, they're standing there, motionless like trees. They start screaming if somebody tries to lift them off the ground. But soil analysis has shown that SCP-2157 objects have no physical connection to the land. Their feet are in no way connected to the soil. A body scan has shown some earth inside their stomach. As soon as an SCP Foundation employee enters their territory, the people turn their heads in their direction and just stare at them. As soon as the outsider leaves, the people start looking to the west again. Monitoring of this object continues. Object SCP-621. It's hypnotic tulips. They look like ordinary tulips, but have bioluminescence. They get energy and other nutrients from the water and glow purple, blue, or green. This glow has a hypnotic effect on people and all nearby living beings. Bees, for example, start pollinating only these flowers, ignoring all other plants, which speeds up the reproduction of the tulips. Herbivores and other natural enemies avoid SCP-621. All this makes tulips a rapidly spreading species. While growing, SCP-621 takes all the nutrients from other plants growing nearby. It depletes the soil and consumes a lot of water. Under the influence of SCP-621, a person tends to take care of the plants and do everything to make them live as long as possible. For example, owners of large fields only take care of the tulips and ignore the rest of their farmlands under the influence of the glow.
Oh God, oh God.
Thus, tulips can spread until they capture all territories, and people will treat them with love because of their hypnotic effect. Therefore, it's crucial to keep tulips in an isolated greenhouse. Employees of the SCP Foundation water them every day and don't allow them to get out of the area. Object SCP-2559-J. While conducting research in one of the laboratories, a scientist accidentally opened a portal to another dimension. Little kittens began to come out of this portal in an endless stream. There's an infinitely huge world of kittens on the other side. If you pick up one of them, it will turn out to be an ordinary little kitty. The portal is located deep underground. It's not yet known how to close it. As a person approaches the doorway, they find themselves under the influence of cute kittens. Now, they're falling out into our reality at a rate of 3 kittens per second. SCP-999 is a large moving mass of transparent orange slime. It looks like jelly and has the viscosity of peanut butter. The shape and size of the creature are constantly changing. The object's surface is covered with a thin, flexible membrane that prevents the mass from spreading in different directions. It's a friendly creature that likes to play with people.
So cute.
It jumps on a person, hugs them, and makes gurgling sounds. SCP-999 emits a pleasant and constantly changing odor. It can be the smell of bacon, or fresh bedding, or roses. Touching SCP-999 causes euphoria that increases with the duration of contact. After that, a person experiences happiness for a long time. The object likes to completely envelop people and tickle them from head to heels. Object SCP-831 is a colony of unknown insects, similar in appearance and properties to ordinary termites. They feed on cellulose and water with sucrose. One termite lives from 25 to 40 days. The colony should remain in an empty, bright room under constant supervision. The walls and floor in the room should be made of high-strength steel. Employees should pour water with nutrients on the floor to maintain the life of these termites. You can only enter the room in a protective suit. When the termites get access to any object, they begin to use it to make the most primitive tools. For example, if you put a pencil in a room, termites will extract graphite and use the wooden body to create chips or something else. If you constantly feed it, the colony will grow and multiply. It will use primitive tools to create modern technologies. These termites know the properties of all substances and understand how to use them to create inventions. With the help of knowledge of the laws of physics and chemistry, and using wood and graphite from the pencil, in a few days, termites can create a primitive steam engine. The longer they stay in some place, and the more they multiply, the more perfect the inventions will be.
Oh, yeah.
A colony of millions of termites can create high-tech machines or radio transmitters that are incomprehensible to people. The boundaries of inventions are unknown, but the results of their work surpass all human technologies. This is why SCP Foundation employees keep SCP-831 in an enclosed, empty room. Object SCP-1689. It's a big bag of potatoes. In stable condition, it weighs about 110 pounds. There are about 200 tubers of ordinary potatoes inside. The inner space of the bag is much larger than it looks from the outside. The size of this area is unknown, but it's completely filled with potatoes. It's impossible to determine where the bag ends.
Oh my God.
SCP Foundation employees once went on an expedition inside the bag. Scientists created a special paste that broke down starch and turned potatoes into liquid slush. This way, the employees made a tunnel for themselves by spraying the substance and raking potato muck with shovels. That's when they found out that the space had a concrete floor, concrete walls, and a ceiling. They were walking inside some kind of building filled with potatoes. The team punched a hole in the wall and left the construction. The ground was covered with dried grass. There were only potatoes around. What was at the top was unknown, since the entire space was filled with potatoes. They also found a rusty bicycle there. The expedition failed. SCP-1689 leads to a world similar to ours, but something happened there, and it began to fill up with potatoes. Object SCP-623. This is a small room built in the 60s by a professor of biochemistry. There are only these items in the room: one blue sofa, one red sofa, one green sofa, one white plastic chair, one round table decorated in the same colors as the sofas, 7 chairs around the round table, and 7 multicolored lighting fixtures. All the furniture is nailed to the floor. Strange patterns are painted on the walls. They perfectly match the style and the location of the furniture. The acoustics and the appearance of the room, as well as the arrangements of all the objects, have a strong, pleasant effect on a person.
Oh, yes.
Inside the room, people feel harmony and happiness. They relax and become kind and harmless. Because of the feeling of peace and serenity, people can't take the furniture out of the room. They just want to dance, laugh, hug the table, lie on the floor, and cry with joy. But as soon as they leave the room, they immediately become angry, aggressive, and sad. The real world outside the room seems to be a dangerous and dark place. If you stay inside the object for more than a few minutes and then go out, you can lose your mind.
We're in England, in the village of Turville. It's 1871. Here, on one street, you can find a particular house. It's no different from the others, but many stay around it and wait for something. The house's doors open. Several adults come out of there. They look surprised and say that all the rumors turned out to be true. The woman goes out on the porch and asks a few more people to come in, and you're among them. You go inside, head into the room, and see an 11-year-old girl sleeping on the bed. She looks pale and thin. Despite loud people's conversations in the room, the girl doesn't wake up. Her mother says it's been 6 months since she fell asleep. You leave the room, and the next few people come in to see the sleeping girl with their own eyes. This is a story about the most prolonged sleep in history. The record belongs to a girl named Ellen Sadler, who slept for 9 years. She was born in the English village of Turville in the second half of the 19th century in a big family. Ellen was the 12th kid. Her parents weren't wealthy and worked hard to make ends meet. They taught their sons and daughters to help them from an early age, and Ellen was no exception. When she turned 11, she left home to work as a nanny in a nearby town. While away from her family and surrounded by strangers, Ellen began to feel bad. She had a headache, felt discomfort, and felt certain drowsiness. These symptoms became so severe that the girl couldn't work properly. She returned to the house in the village, where her parents sent her to the hospital. The doctors didn't know how to help her because they couldn't diagnose her. They spent 18 weeks trying to cure the poor girl. As a result, still unwell, Ellen was discharged from the hospital. After returning home, she experienced severe headaches and drowsiness. Ellen Sadler felt worse and worse. And then, one day, she quietly lay down in her bed and fell asleep. Ellen woke up only after 9 years. All this time, the girl's mother took care of her. She fed her milk and tea. The sleeping girl was losing weight and strength. Soon, the whole village found out about Ellen. People started coming to her house to see an unusual phenomenon. They looked at her, tried to wake her up, and told their friends about her. The news about the sleeping girl spread throughout the country. Ellen had become a spectacle. People from all over England came to see a person who had been sleeping for several years. They called the house where Ellen's family lived Sleepy Cottage. Doctors and reporters came there. One journalist from the Daily Telegraph described that the girl's body was weak and too soft. Her feet were icy cold and her lips were blue. The child's breathing was barely discernible. It seemed that life was slowly leaving this body. The girl's family took donations for the care of their daughter. Therefore, many people thought it was all a performance. For some reason, the mother didn't allow the doctor to stay with Ellen for a long time. Some said that her mother gave her sleeping pills every day to not let her wake up. And someone claimed that they had seen a conscious girl sitting by the window. Also, the girl's mother rejected the doctor's offer to conduct a medical examination in a London hospital. We're unlikely to find out the whole truth about her since there was no official diagnosis from doctors. It's possible the girl fell into a coma or suffered from another disease that was unknown to science in the 19th century. It could be a chronic sleep disorder in which a person experiences uncontrollable bouts of drowsiness. You can walk down the street and want to sleep so much that you fall to the ground. Ellen grew up in a large family and got used to hard work early. Perhaps severe fatigue and lack of sleep provoked narcolepsy. In any case, this story had a good ending. One day, Ellen Sadler woke up. She didn't remember what had happened and was very surprised when her family told her about the 9-year-long dream. The girl's growth slowed down a little and her eyesight worsened, but her health wasn't bad. Ellen got married and had 6 children. In 1911, at the age of about 50, she passed away. Let's see a completely opposite story about a person who set a record for the longest time without sleep. In January 1964, 17-year-old Randy Gardner, a high school student, claimed he stayed awake for several weeks. The experiment started in December and ended in January. At the end of that time, he felt pretty normal. This event was in the Guinness Book of Records and allowed scientists to learn a lot about the structure of the human brain. Randy wanted to do a science school project related to sleep. He had to stay awake as long as possible, and his friend had to make sure that he was always awake. In the beginning, everything went well. Randy's friend kept a diary where he recorded the slightest changes in the subject's body. Randy held on easily for the first 2 days. He was constantly on his feet and didn't come to bed. After 3 days, his cognitive and sensory abilities began to decline. On the 4th day, Randy felt sick. He walked around the house and sniffed citrus fruits. The smell of lemons and oranges helped him get rid of this bad condition. During the day, Randy played basketball and went bowling with friends. The nights were boring because the guys didn't know what to do. But still, Randy didn't go to bed. A week passed and Randy showed excellent basketball results. His physical skills hadn't changed. His speech was clear and logical. By this moment, the news all over the country had been speaking about Randy and his experiment. He became a celebrity, and it also helped him stay awake. Scientists came to Randy. With the help of mathematical questions, they tested his intellectual abilities, and here he showed poor results. He was solving an example in mathematics, but then he forgot what was going on and what he was doing. Scientists scanned his brain and recorded its activity data. Then, on January 8, 1964, at 2 a.m., Randy broke the previous record time without sleep. He was awake for 264 hours. Scientists attached electrodes to his head when he fell asleep and observed brain activity. Randy woke up after a few hours of sleep to go to the toilet. Then, he lay in bed and got up only after 14 hours. He went to school in a great mood. Everyone was shocked. It seemed that his brain-heavy experiment had no negative consequences. Randy continued to study as before, play basketball, and spend time with friends. Scientists studied brain research results and found that Randy's brain was catching a light sleep all this time. These are called microsleeps, and the curious thing is that the person who's experiencing it may not even notice that they're technically sleeping. Several years passed. Everyone already forgot about this record. Randy grew up. One day, a reporter remembered Randy's experiment and interviewed him. He admitted that the experiment hadn't passed without a trace. For many years, Randy experienced severe insomnia. It was driving him crazy. He spent a lot of time and effort to overcome this disease. Fortunately, he managed to adjust his sleep regime. Randy slept 6 hours a day, which was quite enough. Repeating this experiment is a bad idea. Even 2 days without sleep are a great stress for the body. For thousands of years, people have survived hunger and complex work conditions. Our heart is trained to experience high loads, and our body can survive difficult situations. But our body has never encountered a lack of sleep in the entire history of humanity. Evolution has not taught us to endure sleepless nights without consequences, which is why it's bad for our health.
The year was 1854, and the SS Arctic, the fastest passenger liner of its time, set out to cross the Atlantic. As it sailed through the misty veil, it slowly disappeared into the unknown. The Collins Line, an American shipping company, was started in 1818 and only began seriously trading in the transatlantic by 1835. Its steamships crossed the Atlantic from Liverpool to New York within just 10 days. Doesn't sound like a great speed today, I know, but back then, the same thing took other ships several weeks. Light on the water with their wooden hulls, powering through with a strong steam engine, those steamships were the favorite choice for many high-profile people. What could go wrong with such an advanced ship, they thought. This reminds me of some other ship everyone believed to be unsinkable. But anyway, back to the Collins Line. It grew to be a serious contender on transatlantic routes, with only one other competitor, the Cunard's Line. It was a British company also aiming to be the main force through the Arctic Passage. In 1835, the company received a new ship that traveled to Liverpool and came back to New York with the largest cargo ever at that time. From then, the Collins Line was steadily growing. It seemed like there would only be future successes for it. Unfortunately, their lavish ships became costly to run with the amount of coal used. Massive power along with weak wooden hulls meant they needed many repairs after each voyage. So, every trip ended up being expensive. But since the ships were safe and had a great reputation, people were willing to pay the price, and the company was definitely not in crisis. They had achieved something no one had managed to do before them. Like I told you, their ships crossed the Atlantic in a whopping 10 days, and Edward Collins, the owner, was very determined to maintain the pace. Their 5 ships easily outran the Cunard's Line of only 3. With this great praise, it provided more attention. Though the Cunard's ships were slower with their iron hulls, they believed there was still profit, regardless of how slowly they sailed. Among Collins' ships, the Arctic, the third of them to be launched, was the largest, reaching 284 feet long, with 2 side-lever steam engines, each with 1,000 horsepower. The paddle wheels made 16 revolutions a minute when at full speed. At the time of its launch, the press called it the most stupendous vessel ever constructed in the United States. But glamour and fame couldn't avoid what would come next. On the 27th of September, the Arctic was on its journey from Liverpool to New York, continuing a speed pace through the thick fog. It's possible that by that moment, after 4 years of record-breaking trips, the crew became overconfident with their sailing and the ship. Going only 50 miles from Newfoundland, they carelessly continued through the fog with no radio contact, sonar, or any other form of identifying objects, equipped only with Morse code. A smaller ship, the SS Vesta, which operated as a fishing vessel, often worked around Newfoundland. It was passing through the same path as the Arctic and crashed into its side. Shocked by the collision, the captain of the Arctic offered help to the much smaller Vesta, but it was soon clear that the damage that seemed minor on the Arctic was far worse. Beneath the waterline, a hole was letting water into the hull. The cost of the much faster wooden hull now seemed less valuable. They steered toward land, trying to plug the holes, but they weren't doing so well, and the seawater continued to pour in, filling up higher and pushing the ship down. And finally, once the engine room was full, it put out the boilers, taking away the massive power the Arctic was once legendary for. They moved slowly until coming to a complete stop. The ship continued to sink, and the order was to abandon it. At the time, maritime law allowed for the Arctic to carry only 6 lifeboats, only capable of saving 180 people. The crew and some of the passengers managed to push their way aboard and took most of the seats on those boats. Things were pretty wild, and everyone forgot about their manners, not letting the ladies and the youngest ones board first. It took 4 hours for the Arctic to sink. 150 crew and 250 passengers were on board. Those that weren't able to find a lifeboat made a desperate attempt to build their own rafts from parts of the ship. 2 days later, only 3 boats made it safely to the shore. The other 3 were never found. Believe it or not, the rescue party also saved some people that had been clinging to the wreckage for 2 days. Unlike the crew, the captain went down with the Arctic, but amazingly survived. He would be only one of 85 people that made it out of the 400 on board. When the news arrived 2 weeks later, the public responded with great sadness to the losses. Great anger soon followed towards the poor safety measures and the crew. The press published demands to change the laws for more lifeboats. It only made sense to have enough for every person on board a ship. But they ignored those requests. This neglect would lead to more disasters in the future. Enough lifeboats would only come into maritime law some 60 years later, after the disaster of the Titanic. Edward Cullen's wife and 2 children were also aboard the ship and didn't return. He was heartbroken, but didn't stop running his business. The Collins line still had a reputation to uphold, the biggest, fastest, and most luxurious on the Atlantic. Edward Collins would now build an even better ship than any other. It was named the Adriatic, and it was the largest ship in the world, 354 feet long. With 2 alternating steam engines that had never been built of this size. These steam engines at the time were at the height of engineering, though today you can only see them in models and toys. With the new addition of 2 masts, the Adriatic would also be able to sail if needed. Luckily, they made some lessons from the disaster of the Arctic. But before their new ship, the Adriatic, was built, another disaster had occurred. The sister ship of the Arctic had also sunk. They believed this second ship was desperate to stay in front of the Cunard's line and hit an iceberg somewhere during the race. This weird contest took the lives of 141 people. The desperation of Collins and his weakly built hulls pushed the company towards bankruptcy in 1858. The newly built Adriatic, costing over $1 million, had only made 1 voyage in the end. And even that voyage was considered a disaster. The ship collided with a tugboat. It still managed to finish its maiden voyage at a suitable time. After the company had gone bankrupt, they had to sell the ship for only $50,000. They removed the great giant engines, replacing them with only sails. Although it was once the greatest ship on the high seas, it was only 30 years later until it was abandoned, labeled irreparable, and anchored in a river. The other remaining ships were also sold and only used for parts. Edward Collins left the industry altogether, seeking work on dry land instead. As the Collins line was no longer in the mix, the Cunards would grow in strength. Without competition, they would win the Blue Ribbon for the next 30 years, and 180 years later, after producing hundreds of ships. They still have a constant presence on the seas as they provide transatlantic crossings, world voyages, and leisure cruises. To this day, the Cunard line is the only one to run ships between Europe and America, and it's great proof that it's not always the fastest that's the best. The theory of parallel worlds has been discussed in the scientific community for a very long time. Unfortunately, we're not developed enough yet to prove or disprove it. But it's still an interesting theory, and that's why we have a lot of unusual urban legends about the guests from a parallel reality, according to many. Let's check out a few of them. A man from a non-existent country. This story took place in 1851 in a small German village, Frankfurt an der Oder. A lost man came out to the local villagers asking for help. The man introduced himself as Jopar Voren. He spoke very poor German and had a very strong accent. The man himself claimed that he speaks Laxar and Abram, languages that don't actually exist on our Earth. He claimed to be from Laxaria, a country on the mainland called Sacria, separated from Europe by a huge ocean. However, none of these places existed on the Earth's map. People sent Jopar to the local authorities. He talked to a psychiatrist, but the doctor concluded that the man was totally sane. An investigation by the local police also revealed nothing suspicious about him. Jopar Voren claimed that the purpose of his visit to Europe was to find his long-lost brother. He survived a shipwreck and found himself near the village. They showed him a map of the world and a globe and asked him to indicate the place where he crashed, but he didn't recognize anything familiar. He seemed to have extensive knowledge about his homeworld. Jopar named 5 main continents on it: Sacria, Aflar, Astar, Auslar, and Uplar. His story was considered plausible. Scientists from Frankfurt decided to send the man to Berlin for further research. However, during the trip, he had something like a seizure. The man suddenly jumped out of the carriage and disappeared into the surrounding forest. Despite a long and thorough search, no traces of Jopar were found. He seemed to have disappeared as mysteriously as he had appeared. Inspector Leboeuf, who was assigned to escort him to Berlin, thought this man could be a being from another world, and that he had returned from where he had come from. Lady on Highway 167. This incident happened on October 20th, 1969. It was first reported in 1988 in the magazine Strange. The article tells about 2 men, LC and his business partner, Charlie. The names are fictitious. One afternoon, LC and Charlie were driving along Highway 167 in southwest Louisiana. Discussing work, they drove toward the oil center of Lafayette. The highway was empty at first, but then the men noticed a very old and very slow car ahead. The men started discussing this mysterious car. Such cars hadn't been produced for several decades, but this one looked quite new. The men thought it was thanks to the owner's care and admired it. They slowed down to get a better look at the car. LC noticed a bright orange sign on it that said 1940. They saw a driver. It was a young woman in old-fashioned clothes, a hat with a long feather and a fur coat, even though it was warm outside. There was a child next to her, also dressed in a warm coat and a hat. LC and Charlie wanted to talk to her, but then they noticed the expression on her face. The woman was looking around in panic, almost on the verge of crying. LC called out to her and asked if she needed help. She nodded, and he gestured for her to park on the side of the road. But when the men also parked, they suddenly noticed that the woman's car had disappeared. They looked around the highway in shock. She couldn't have gone somewhere far so fast, but the car was nowhere to be found. After some time, another man drove up to LC and Charlie. He saw everything that happened and claimed that the car had simply disappeared. The men talked about the incident for several hours. When they reached the city, they contacted the police. However, the police couldn't help them in any way. Apart from their words, there was no confirmation of the existence of the car. The case was discussed for a while in local newspapers and then was forgotten. The Gadianton Canyon Incident. This incident occurred in May of 1972 in southeastern Utah near the Modena Railroad crossing on the edge of the Escalante Desert. Jenna North was driving her father's 1971 Chevrolet Nova. Her friend, Carol Abbott, was in the passenger seat. In the back seat, there were 2 other girls, Lisa Rockford and Bethany Gordon. It was after 10 p.m. when the girls crossed the Utah-Nevada state line. They wanted to get back to campus before their housekeeper, Mrs. Mortensen, locked the dorm doors. This stretch of Highway 56 in Utah is pretty deserted. There's nothing there but sand and a few plants. The girls were very happy when they finally noticed the Union Pacific Railroad crossing in Modena. But right behind the railing, Jenna noticed two highways. One went into the desert, and the other to Gadianton Canyon. The girls decided to take the road to the canyon. They thought it would be a shortcut to campus. The other girls were chatting with each other when Jenna noticed that they were no longer driving on asphalt, but on white cement. "Watch out!" suddenly shouted one of the girls. The road ended abruptly at a high rock wall. It was a dead end. They had to go back the same way they came here. And while Jenna's friends were complaining that now they would have to sleep in the car, Jenna saw that the landscape had changed dramatically. They weren't in the desert anymore. Instead, the canyon turned into an open area with wheat fields, pine thickets, and a small lake ahead. A full moon was shining in the sky, which was strange because it shouldn't have been there that night. The girls had no idea where they were, so they just drove to the light ahead. It was some building that they thought was a diner or restaurant. The girls saw a bright neon sign, but none of them could read what was written on it. These symbols were unlike any language they knew. Suddenly, several people came out of the building. They seemed shocked and frightened by Jenna's Chevrolet. They waved their hands and shouted something, but the girls didn't understand them. Lisa decided to ask the men for directions. She stuck her head out of the window and immediately let out a terrifying scream. "Get out of here!" she shouted to Jenna. The Chevrolet sped away from the building. Bright headlights illuminated their car from behind. They were being chased by a few vehicles. These vehicles were egg-shaped, had 3 wheels, and made a buzzing sound. The road ahead led back to the canyon. Jenna didn't have time to slow down and crashed right into it. The vehicles had disappeared, together with an unfamiliar landscape. The girls were back in the desert again. Fortunately, none of them were hurt, physically. But Lisa was in a state of shock. She was saying again and again, "They weren't human!" The girls had to help her walk. An hour later, they were able to stop a Utah Highway Patrol car. They told the police their story. The details of the report compiled by the police officer were complicated and confusing. During the investigation, the police couldn't figure out from the tire tracks exactly where the car went astray. The tracks ended very abruptly, as if the Chevrolet had suddenly disappeared. The police couldn't explain how the car could have driven 2 miles without leaving any traces, especially on such solid ground. There are still disputes about this story, but in the end, all versions and explanations of what happened are just guesses. Perhaps we'll never find out the truth. These were the urban legends about interdimensional traveling. Of course, there's no proof that any of these stories are real. Often the truth turns out to be very mundane. For example, the famous man from Taured, who people also called a guest from another reality, turned out to be a simple fraudster named John Allen Kuchar Zegrus. But even so, these stories are still very interesting.
It's winter, 1980. We're in the small town of Lengby. 19-year-old Jean Hilliard is driving home after meeting with a friend. She takes a shortcut and turns into an icy, slippery road. In the dark, she loses control of the rear-wheel drive car. The vehicle crashes into a ditch. Emergency lights, snowfall, night, and a hard frost. Jean gets out of the vehicle. She's wearing only a light winter coat, mittens, and cowboy boots. The air temperature is much lower than in a freezer. Jean is sure that her friend lives nearby, so she goes that way. She climbs a high hill and realizes she's taken the wrong route. It seems she's gotten lost. The girl wanders a couple more miles and notices her other friend's house in the distance. Freezing, she walks there. Then everything turns black. Jean loses consciousness. The next morning, rancher Wally Nelson wakes up in a great mood. It's the holiday season. There's a winter fairy tale outside the window. He leaves his house and notices the body of Jean Hilliard lying just a few feet from his porch. Wally approaches the girl, shakes her, and is horrified. Her body is stiff and cold like frozen wood. Her eyes are open and don't move. Her hair is frozen. She just doesn't look alive. But Wally sees that she's still breathing. Jean has managed to survive. Wally wants to put her in his car to bring her to the doctor, but the girl's body doesn't bend and can't fit into the auto. It feels like a statue. He takes a bigger car and rushes to the hospital as fast as possible. The doctors take Jean, but they don't think she has any chance to make it. Her hand is so hard and frozen that no needle can penetrate it. A low temperature, glassy eyes, and muscles as hard as stone are all the results of emergency mode. Her body has directed all the blood to the vital organs to ensure their functioning. That's why other parts of her body look so lifeless, and her skin and muscles don't react to anything. The doctors decide to put heating pads on the girl to warm her up. Her family hopes for her recovery, but right now, all they can do is just wait. Frostbite is so dangerous because all that frozen liquid begins to expand. Fill a small bottle with water and put it in the freezer for a few hours. Then take it out, and you'll see that the bottle seems to have expanded or even cracked because of the increased volume of the liquid. The same thing happens inside our bodies. We consist of almost 70% water. When it freezes, its particles turn into ice crystals and tear cell membranes. Ice fragments can stretch and destroy tissue. This is called frostbite. Also, our body can slow down all internal processes in extreme cold conditions to save strength and energy. The heart makes fewer beats, and the lungs stop consuming lots of oxygen. Metabolism slows down. It happened with Jean, and perhaps it is what saved her life that day. She was lying in the snow in severe frost for about 6 hours. But why didn't the ice particles start destroying her cell membranes? How did her body withstand such damage and manage to survive? Back at the hospital, doctors are happy to watch Jean get better. Warm blood spreads through the frozen vessels and brings her body back to life. Surprisingly, ice crystals haven't damaged her muscles and skin. A few hours later, the girl regains consciousness. By noon, she starts talking. Jean doesn't know what happened. She remembers walking to her friend's house and then waking up in the hospital. What worries her most right now is that her father's car is somewhere in a ditch. As it turns out, the girl fell down and crawled on all fours to Wally Nelson's house. She doesn't remember it, but apparently her brain activated the survival instinct that night. Unfortunately, she didn't manage to crawl the last few feet. Jean passed out at the door and stayed there for 6 hours. Doctors examine the girl and understand that she's completely healthy. Soon, she's discharged from the hospital. This case isn't unique. One professor of emergency medicine, David Plummer, said he'd seen about 12 similar cases over the past 10 years when patients had survived severe frostbite. Jean returns home and finds out that she has become famous. People write about her in newspapers, want to interview her, and film documentary shows. Her case has attracted the attention of many doctors around the world, but no one has been able to find out exactly how she managed to survive. In the case of humans, such recoveries seem like an absolute miracle. But many creatures of the natural world can adapt their bodies to extreme conditions. One of them is the tree frog. These animals live mainly in temperate and tropical parts of Eurasia. Sometimes they have to contend with cold weather. Their body injects glucose into the bloodstream when they feel they're freezing, and the content of their cells turns into syrup. Sugar lowers the freezing point of water. So, tree frogs have adapted to such conditions. The water outside their cells can freeze. Their bodies can get as hard as ice cubes, but they will be alive, feeling great. Then, when it gets warmer, they fully recover. The blood fills their body and puts all their muscles in motion. But one of the most amazing animals that can withstand freezing temperatures is the ghoulish icefish. It's transparent and somewhat like a jellyfish. It swims in the dark, cold Antarctic waters. The ghoulish icefish feels comfortable there because of the antifreeze in its body. More precisely, it's a unique substance that is like antifreeze in its functions. This liquid doesn't allow the animal's cells, organs, and the whole body to freeze. There are no red blood cells in the fish's blood that transport oxygen throughout its body. This is the only vertebrate with such a superpower. There are organisms on our planet that use the cold to prolong their life. Scientists have found some of them in the ice of Siberia. Those are microscopic, multi-celled creatures, like small worms, that can live in a freezer for about 10 years. But the worms from Siberia were about 24,000 years old. The scientists transported them to the laboratory and thawed them. The worms came to life and began to multiply immediately after all those centuries of sleep. Their bodies can go into cryptobiosis. This is when an entire frozen organism has minimal vital functions. The analysis showed that the worms could stay in this mode for tens of thousands of years. And there are many such animals on our planet. Also, these creatures are some of the world's most resistant to radiation. They are practically invulnerable. Now back to our story. It's possible that Jean Hilliard's body went into short cryptobiosis. Perhaps there was some non-freezing liquid in the girl's blood, but no one knows for sure. These days, she has an ordinary job and almost doesn't remember that day. Further research on this topic can help scientists create special medicines that can help in freezing temperatures. Just imagine that you could safely go outside in the winter wearing a t-shirt and a pair of shorts. Steam would be coming off your body, and the ice under your feet would be melting. You'd feel hot inside. A dream, perhaps. But realistically, winter coat manufacturers would, of course, never allow it.